Here's what's coming up on the world today. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh visits Cairo for ceasefire talks in Gaza. Former U.S. President Donald Trump campaigns in the U.S. state of Iowa after court bars him from the 2024 Colorado ballot. And Russian President Vladimir Putin awards war soldiers, promises to go to the end to protect Russia's interests. Hello everyone, welcome to the program. I'm Joke Rogers in Lagos. The leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, is in the Egyptian capital, Cairo, for talks on a fresh ceasefire in Gaza. The Hamas leader is usually based in Qatar, but his visit to the Egyptian capital is the latest sign of possible movement in negotiations, even as Israeli President Isaac Herzog says his country is ready for another humanitarian pause. Earlier, before traveling to Egypt, Mr. Haniyeh met with Iran's Foreign Minister Hossein Abdulrahian in Qatar. Egypt, alongside Qatar, helped broker a week-long truce last week that led to the release of about 100 hostages captured by Hamas in exchange for 240 Palestinians held in Israeli prison. In the meantime, explosions and flares could be seen earlier over Gaza from southern Israel as Israeli forces continued their bombardment of the enclave. Israel has dropped thousands of tons of munitions over the past 10 weeks, leaving the narrow Mediterranean Strip in ruins and killing nearly 20,000, as many Gaza officials claim are under collapsed buildings. Another 50,000 are injured, with almost no healthcare facilities working. Heavy civilian casualties are the cost of Israel's intense campaign to destroy Hamas in Gaza. Israel's top war aim is to dismantle Hamas's military capabilities to prevent further attacks and regrouping. And the spokesperson for the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, James Elder, is concerned that children and families are not safe in hospitals in Gaza. This is the enclave's wider healthcare system, and it's on the edge of collapse. Speaking in Geneva after a recent visit to Gaza, Mr. Elder added that over the past 48 hours, the largest remaining fully functioning hospital was shelled twice. The hospital, Al Nasser in Khan Yunis, not only shelters large numbers of children who had already been badly injured in attacks on their homes, but hundreds of women and children seeking safety. It comes after a 13-year-old girl, Dina Mohsen, was killed by a shell that landed in part of the Nasser medical complex in southern Gaza, and that's according to the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health within the Strip. And now we'll take a look. Meanwhile, the United Nations Relief Agency has released its daily update, noting that continued disruptions to phone and internet services in most areas of the Gaza Strip are severely affecting emergency operations and access to information. According to the United Nations, as at Tuesday, the telecommunications blackout had continued for 6 days, apart from a partial restoration in southern Gaza on December 18. According to officials, other updates include heavy Israeli bombardments from air, land and sea continued across Gaza, with the most intense shelling reported in Beit Hanun, Jabalia and Beit Lahia, all in the north. More than 360,000 cases of infectious diseases, including acute respiratory infections, meningitis, jaundice, impetigo, and chickenpox, have been recorded in the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees and who are in those shelters. Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council has met ahead of a vote on a proposal to demand that Israel and Hamas allow aid access to the Gaza Strip via land, sea, and of course, air routes. The United Arab Emirates drafted the resolution with Deputy UN Ambassador Mohammed Abu Shahab terming the year 2023 the deadliest year in the occupied Palestinian territory. According to him, this should be a wake-up call that the current status quo cannot be allowed to continue.
We are now to the end of what was the deadliest year in the occupied Palestinian territory. This should be a wake-up call that the current status quo cannot be allowed to continue. 2.2 million people remain trapped, with 9 out of every 10 spending entire days without food. Gazans are experiencing unprecedented levels of starvation and thirst, while doctors lack even the most basic of medical supplies to treat the wounded and the growing threat of infection. What we need is access. The resolution that we will vote on later today aims to meet this need by demanding the use of all land, sea, and air routes to allow aid to enter. Israel must stop blocking the entry of aid and allow life-saving assistance into the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, less than 100 kilometers away from Gaza, people in the West Bank are living in a situation of violence and fear that has escalated over the past 2 months. Since 7 October, the number of people killed in the West Bank has increased. 278 Palestinians, including 70 children, have lost their lives. This is more than half of the total number since the beginning of the year, in a year that was already witnessing unprecedented levels of violence. Just because those with extremist voices shout the loudest does not mean that they should decide the fate of the region.
We are banning those responsible for settler violence from entering the UK to make sure our country cannot be a home for people who commit these intimidating acts. And we reiterate our call on Israel to immediately and completely stop all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory.
As this may be the last meeting for my country as member of the Council on this issue, just like we have said and repeated in every one of them, we look forward to the moment when the two-state solution is advanced, not like an empty mantra, not as an easy substitute to failure, not as a placebo, but as a genuine process so that the Israelis and Palestinians find the way to get out of the horrible deadlock, of the terrible impasse and the perpetual failures over decades, and together with the international community, design, agree and implement to live side by side, each in their own state, in dignity, prosperity and security, free from terror and insecurity. If not, even if this Hamas is dismantled, its ideology will remain, and if it's not abandoned or eradicated, plans will remain dreams, dreams will be crushed, and the harsh and unforgiving reality will perpetuate. And it will be, unfortunately, only a matter of time until the next tragedy unfolds.
We take a brief pause on the Israel-Hamas crisis as we turn our attention now to the Russia-Ukraine invasion. One person who is confident about the U.S. support for their country is Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Speaking at a news conference in the capital, Kyiv, Mr. Zelensky said he was confident the U.S. would not betray Ukraine by withholding crucial wartime fundings as it fights off a Russian invasion. Aid for Ukraine has been held up by Republicans in the U.S. Congress, and the White House has warned that it will run out by the end of the year if not renewed. He also said he expected the European Union to approve a €50 billion aid package soon. And for Russian President Vladimir Putin, he is vowing that the country will go till the end to protect Russia's interests. He made the disclosure at the the award ceremony in Moscow, where he honored a group of soldiers who fought in Ukraine with the country's top gold star medals. Speaking to the awarded soldiers, Mr. Putin said, in his words, "It's an award from motherland for every one of us. All together, including myself, we will go till the end to protect Russia's interests." Early on Tuesday, President Putin said that Moscow will continue what it calls its special operation in Ukraine, and that all attempts to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia had crumbled. The United Nations Human Rights Chief Volker Turk says there has been an extensive failure by Russia to take adequate measures to protect civilians in Ukraine, and that there were indications that Russian forces had committed war crimes. Briefing reporters at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, Mr. Turk noted that his office is monitoring indicated gross violations of international human rights law, serious violations of international human rights law, and war crimes primarily by the forces of the Russian Federation. However, Russia has vigorously denied committing atrocities or targeting civilians in Ukraine.
This document, it has been 662 days since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. My office continues to undertake extensive monitoring and documentation by our human rights monitoring mission in Ukraine, based on the rigorous and tried and tested methodology we have developed over decades. This documentation continues to indicate gross violations of international human rights law, serious violations of international humanitarian law, and war crimes, primarily by the forces of the Russian Federation. They include 142 cases of summary execution of civilians since February 2022 in territory controlled by Russian armed forces or occupied by the Russian Federation. I urge all states, especially those with influence, to call for immediate and decisive measures by both parties, and in particular by the Russian Federation, to ensure that their personnel fully comply with international human rights and international humanitarian law. They must take all feasible precautions to avoid and minimize civilian harm, including through the selection of means and methods of warfare. They must cease the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas and scrupulously map the location of mines.
And refugees in the Western Sahara refugee camps say their plight and predicament has been sidelined as a result of the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. The refugee camps shelter about 175,000 people and sees less than the humanitarian aid it gets normally.
Wars in Ukraine and Gaza mean Western Sahara refugee camps are receiving less humanitarian aid, according to a Sahrawi woman in the Samra refugee camp earlier this month. In refugee camps, which shelter about 175,000 people, daily life is a drudge, says 30-year-old Manana, who complains there is less food being supplied by humanitarian agencies and less variety.
Well, when the war in Ukraine started, and now in Gaza, there's a difference in humanitarian aid that we've been receiving, because we used to have more than this, but now we're receiving less humanitarian aid. We have been here for almost 50 years. We get always the same food. There's been no changes. As always, we live with oil, flour and lentils, and that's how we live. But now it has changed because of the wars.
Sahrawi refugees live in 6 camps of Rabuni, Bojador, Smara, Used, El Ayun and Dakhla. Morocco considers Western Sahara its own, but an Algeria-backed independence movement, the Polisario Front, demands a sovereign state and has been fighting for independence, causing an exodus of refugees from Africa's longest-running territorial disputes.
We don't want to take the lands of any country, we just want our land. We don't want anything that's not the Sahara. Well, I like it, my land, and if I need to die here, I would do it to defend our independence. These lands are not for us, are not ours, but from other country. I just can't let the Sahara be abandoned.
Western Sahara has been at a diplomatic impasse for more than 20 years since the ceasefire came into force between the Polisario and Morocco on the understanding a referendum would be held on independence.
Welcome back. Updates on China's deadly 6.2 magnitude quake, where volunteers are preparing emergency supplies for displaced residents 2 days after the disaster. The earthquake, which rocks China's northwestern Gansu and Qinghai provinces on Monday, killed at least 131 people, injuring hundreds and toppling homes. Supplies like food, water, tents, stoves and futons were transported by local volunteers. Recovery from the earthquake has been further challenged by a powerful cold snap that has whipped most of China since last week. Well, it's rendezvous for North Korea as the United Nations Security Council held talks following Pyongyang's recent nuclear provocations. The meeting comes after North Korea said it had tested the isolated state's newest intercontinental ballistic missile to gauge the war readiness of its nuclear force against mounting U.S. hostility as Washington and its allies began operating a real-time missile data sharing system. The United States and South Korea have increased the intensity of joint military drills against threats from the north.
According to the official news agency of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, and various government sources, the DPRK launched the Hwasong-18 type intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, at 8:24 a.m. local time on 18th of December. The missile flew a distance of approximately 1,000 kilometers and reached an altitude of 6,500 kilometers before falling into the sea. This is the fifth launch of an ICBM in 2023.
We have used every word to describe the DPRK's continued threats to international peace and security. Flagrant, unacceptable, reckless, egregious. All of these words still apply. But today, I offer another word, ridiculous. Ridiculous to assert this launch, in addition to the SRBM launch, is in any way justifiable or an appropriate response to a meeting.
I must begin by expressing once again our condemnation in the strongest possible terms of the utterly unacceptable provocation by North Korea in violation of multiple Security Council resolutions. The latest ICBM is estimated to have impacted in the waters near Japan just 250 kilometers from Hokkaido. A number of fishing vessels were out at sea and a number of aircraft were flying at the time of the launch. Once again, this irresponsible launch endangered vessels, exposed aircraft in the surrounding area to great risk, and terrified Japanese citizens.
The United States and their hostile forces have persistently committed acts of the military threat against DPRK throughout this year. They are becoming almost unmisguided and extremely dangerous until this moment in December closed year end. The ICBM launch conducted by DPRK this time is a warning countermeasure in the face of the grave situation. This notwithstanding, the United States and few countries blindly following it forcibly convened this meeting again to be recorded as a shameful one in the history of the United Nations, while illegally and unlawfully taking issue with the DPRK, which exercise undeniable just and legitimate right of the sovereign state to self-defense, recognized by international law, including UN Charter, and equally conferred on all UN member states.
You're watching The World Today. Let's return our attention to the Israel-Hamas war and get the latest on the latest developments there today. The VOA's Edward Uranian joins us now from Cairo. Hello, Edward. Good to see you today. What more do we know as regards the Hamas leaders' visit to Cairo?
Joking, the Egyptian intelligence chief, Abbas Kemp, usually conducts the negotiations, and for this reason, they're not publicized to the extent other discussions are with the foreign minister or with even with the president. But he is the president's right-hand man. They're talking about going to some sort of a ceasefire. That's the buzz that you're hearing in the media. I don't know what other things they're talking about. They usually talk about a lot of other things that are not in the media. And the Egyptian intelligence chief has been the point man for Gaza and a lot of other things for the last, I think he's been in this position for 4 or 5 years now. So he's a fairly savvy negotiator. He knows the Israeli leaders as well as the Palestinian leaders. I don't think he has a lot of sympathy for Hamas per se. Neither does Egypt, but both sides are compelled to have normal relations and talk to each other, just as all the other parties are, as a matter of fact.
Well, so everybody knows what's going on, especially Egypt that shares, borders with some of those in conflict. And so, how are Egyptians receiving, his visits? Are there mixed feelings or sentiments whatsoever?
I think Egyptians in general sympathize with the Palestinian people. I don't know that there's a great wave of sympathy for Hamas. Certainly the government has none, and I think they've been trying to negotiate for the last, 12 years to try to get both sides, the PLO and Hamas, to talk and come up with an agreement, and they haven't. So there's no intention of doing that, and a lot of the talking has been in vain, and probably a lot of this talking is going to be in vain. But they're trying. Let them try. There's a war going on. People are getting killed.
And it appears to be, a good sign of sort with this visit, and seeing that the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, has said that his country is also ready for another humanitarian pause in Gaza. Now all eyes are on this meeting with the Egyptian intelligence chief.
Well, if anyone can pull it off, it's Abbas Kamel. I don't know that he's going to be able to pull it off, but if anyone can, he's the man. He's a very good negotiator. He knows exactly what the strategic points are of both parties, and he would be able to pinch both sides in order to come up with a deal where many other parties would not.
And Edward, what's the situation at the Rafah border crossing? We know aid flow coming in has been at a low after the temporary pause between Israel and Hamas.
Well, I think the Egyptian side, as well as the Israeli side, is not eager to let a lot of this aid go into the hands of Hamas. And there's clear indication from past aid shipments that a lot of it is going into the hands of Hamas. Hamas is conducting an effort, a war effort, and so are the Israelis. And there's no real eagerness to support Hamas's war effort, but they would like to help the civilians. Now, I don't think they've been able to square the circle so far as to how to help the civilians without aiding Hamas's war effort.
Thank you for your time today.
My pleasure, Joka.
Let's move ahead now as we head to the United States. Colorado's Supreme Court has ruled that Donald Trump cannot run for president next year in the state, citing a constitutional insurrection clause. The court ruled 4-3 that Mr. Trump was not an eligible candidate because he had engaged in an insurrection over the U.S. Capitol riot nearly 3 years ago. However, Mr. Trump's campaign has vowed to appeal the U.S. Supreme Court. Shortly after the court's verdict, Mr. Trump wasted no time to address a rally in the U.S. state of Iowa.
Crooked Joe Biden and the far-left lunatics are desperate to stop us by any means necessary. They are willing to violate the U.S. Constitution at levels never seen before in order to win this election. Joe Biden is a threat to democracy. It's a threat. They're weaponizing law enforcement for high-level election interference because we're beating them so badly in the polls. We will restore law and order to our communities, and I will direct a completely overhauled DOJ to investigate every radical, out-of-control prosecutor, of which we have many, in America. I have a guy named Deranged Jack Smith. He's a deranged person. He happens to be after me.
Let's bring in national security law and foreign policy experts Joanna LeBlanc for more on this. Hi, Joanna. Great to see you. How do you perceive the recent Colorado Supreme Court ruling? It appears to be a significant setback for Mr. Trump, doesn't it? Even though they want to appeal.
Thank you so much for having me on. And first and foremost, let me start out by saying that the recent Colorado Supreme Court ruling is a historic court decision, absolutely unprecedented. And when it comes to the name Mr. Trump, I believe that it is at this point synonymous to the word unprecedented. A lot has happened politically, legally speaking, that has never happened before in the history of this nation. But let me say this. When it comes to whether or not this is a setback for Mr. Trump, it really depends on the lens which you view this court ruling from, right? So looking at this purely from a campaign perspective, Mr. Trump could use this as leverage to further demonstrate to his supporters that he is being attacked by the left for his bold pro-America stance, right? And he can also further argue that because of my commitment to defending the domestic interest of Americans, the left is trying to keep me off the ballot to provide adequate representation at the highest office here in America, which is the White House.
And despite this, it's worth noting that the ruling doesn't necessarily prevent him from running in other states. His campaign has indicated an intention to appeal, to the Supreme Court, as I stated earlier. If the appeal doesn't proceed as anticipated, what potential implications do you foresee? Well,
I think knowing who Mr. Trump is, we can certainly anticipate that there will be an appeal by the Supreme Court, and because you have to look at what's at stake currently, and given the reality that primaries are around the corner, so I think that the Supreme Court will have no choice but to hear this case, and the question that will be on the hearts and the minds of the Supreme Court justices, beyond the legal arguments, would be whether the courts should decide if Mr. Trump should be on the ballot for the presidency, or should that right be reserved for the American people, quote unquote, the voters to decide. And I think this is going to weigh heavily on the opinions of the Supreme Court justices. And I anticipate that the Supreme Court will rule in favor of Mr. Trump, because I don't think the Supreme Court wants to set a precedent that in a way allows or gives the court great ammunition to determine how the American people should vote. Even though the question here is also, from a constitutional perspective, if Mr. Trump did indeed engage in the insurrection that occurred in January of several years ago here in America, he should be disqualified from running for the presidency. And that's what our U.S. Constitution says. But I think that at the same token, the question as to whether or not the right for Mr. Trump to appear on the ballot should be reserved for the court to decide or should be reserved for the American people to decide will be the two greatest aspect that the Supreme Court will look at when making a decision. And ultimately, I think that the Supreme Court will vote in favor of Mr. Trump.
Right. And Mr. Trump has repeatedly said that, the opposition is trying to ensure that he doesn't get, to be voted for at all. Do you think, the Biden administration and his camp, do you think they're under any kind of pressure, which is why, Mr. Trump is saying that this is what they're trying to do?
Well, Mr. Trump, from the beginning, even when you look at his first indictment in New York City, and his second one in Georgia, and subsequent indictments, Mr. Trump has always maintained that this is a political witch hunt. And beyond maintaining that it is a political witch hunt, Mr. Trump has also used some of these legal battles to raise money from his supporters. And the thing about Mr. Trump that is so fascinating is that no matter how many times Mr. Trump is indicted, no matter how many times the legal issues come up, his supporters are supporting him even more than ever before. Right now, Mr. Trump is the leading candidate within the Republican Party to gain the Republican nomination to ultimately run for the presidency on the Republican ticket. That is the reality. And our polls here in America is also showing that he is even surpassing Mr. Biden, our current president, in terms of popularity. So Mr. Trump will, without a shadow of a doubt, utilize this Supreme Court ruling to further galvanize his supporters, to show that, listen here, they really want to deprive you, the American people, from making a decision who's going to be the next president of the United States of America. And another thing about Mr. Trump is that he is incredibly brilliant when it comes to public relations and the media. So I am confident he is going to further use this to bolster and to raise money for his campaign and also his legal fees, quite frankly.
Right. And similar attempts, were made to kick him off the ballot in, New Hampshire, Minnesota, and Michigan, and they have failed. Do you think that we'll be seeing any that may be successful at all?
Those attempts may or may not be successful because we saw in Colorado, rather, the lower court had actually agreed that Mr. Trump had engaged in insurrection, but indicated that the Constitution was not speaking to the office of the presidency. It was speaking to other offices, which is why it was ultimately appealed to the Colorado Supreme Court. So I do foresee similar attempts in New Hampshire, Minnesota, Michigan, and even other states across America, which is why the Supreme Court has to speak on this matter because there's a lot at stake. We have the primaries coming up, and to not waste any more time, the Supreme Court will have to make the decision that will impact the entire nation, because now this becomes a national a national thing, right? And then also, too, beyond the different states, you have secretary of states in different different states across the United States that can also bring forth suit against Mr. Trump. So if the Supreme Court does not hear this case, there's going to be a ripple effect across America, in particular in states where it's considered to be a more of a liberal state, right? And states where Mr. Trump perhaps may not have as many support, right? So that's the reality. But also the reality is that many agree that Mr. Trump did indeed engage in insurrectionist behavior and that he is an insurrectionist and therefore should not be on the ballot as indicated by our Constitution here in the United States. There are two requirements for the presidency here in America. One, you have to be the age of 35 or above. And secondly, you cannot be an insurrectionist. And here, Mr. Trump has deemed to be one. So I think the Supreme Court will have no choice but to hear this case before the primaries. So we should expect the Supreme Court to hear this matter as early as January or even early February.
Right. And then, you did talk about Mr. Trump's popularity increasing and almost surpassing the current president. That's for those who believe that, he should trump ahead and, go for it. But there are those who don't feel that way. What are the other reactions that we're getting from U.S. citizens as far as this, case is concerned?
Well, this court ruling, again, what I said earlier about whether or not it should be left to the courts to decide if a presidential candidate should be on the ballot, or should that be left to the voters to decide, the American people, is something that the entire United States is talking about right now. Even those who may not be in support of Mr. Trump are a bit frustrated with the court ruling because they do believe that, the United States is setting a bad precedent, right? And it looks as though the court is being used as a political tool to keep Mr. Trump from running for the presidency. And we have seen time and time again how the United States has imposed sanctions on individuals and institutions across the African continent that have deemed to undermine democracy and free, fair, transparent elections in various countries. So some are saying that this kind of court ruling further undermines the United States position on supporting free, fair, transparent and elections across the world, because here we have a situation where the candidate appears to be, depending again who's looking at this, appears to be trying to be stalled by the courts to not proceed with the presidential elections, when that decision should be left to the American people, the voters, to decide, not a court here in America.
Right, Joanna, thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Elsewhere, a group of South Korean students are suing the government because their college admission examination ended 90 seconds earlier than scheduled. The students are asking for 20 million won each. That's equivalent of $15,400, the cost of a year studying to retake the exam. The country's infamous college admission test, known as Sunyung, is an 8-hour marathon with back-to-back papers in multiple subjects. The Sunyung is one of the hardest exams in the world, and stakes are very high. The results of this year's exam were released on December 8, and according to their lawyers, the error affected the rest of the students' exams. Welcome back. Over in Guinea, where the government is warning its citizens to brace up for power cuts as the country grapples with the aftermath of a deadly explosion at an oil terminal in the capital, Conakry. In its first update on the extent of the damage to the terminal, the government said 13 fuel tanks were out of service, while 5 tanks were unaffected. At petrol stations, people are queuing for hours due to fuel shortages, and transport costs have surged. 14 people were killed and 190 injured in the blast at the West African nation's main oil terminal, which rocks the Kaloum district in downtown Conakry. Voting continues in the Democratic Republic of Congo's high-stakes presidential election after polls opened this morning. Citizens have complained about lengthy delays at polling stations, waiting in long queues in the capital, Kinshasa, and other cities as they opened about 2 hours late. Correspondents on ground report that ballot papers were delivered at the last minute in the eastern cities of Goma and Beni. Some people struggled to find their names on the voter lists, which were only made available today. Visuals of the President Felix Tshisekedi voting are yet to surface, but he is pitted against 18 candidates, which include presidential candidate Martin Fayulu, who voted in the upmarket Gombe district in the capital. After voting, he branded the country's general election as total chaos. Nobel Peace Prize-winning gynecologist Denis Mukwege, who is also vying for presidency, cast his vote in Kinshasa. Millionaire businessman and former governor Moise Katumbi, who is seen as a strong challenger in the presidential race, cast his vote in Lubumbashi. He urged his supporters to monitor the publication of results in each polling unit. As a result of insecurity and rebel activity, voting did not take place in the eastern provinces. In the meantime, as citizens vote for new leaders, they are also seeking a change in their daily living from whomever emerges winner of the presidential election. Take a listen to their plight.
5 years after graduating with a diploma in computer network maintenance, Georges Bamoué is still navigating the streets of Kinshasa as a motorcycle taxi rider and unable to find a job or raise funds to start his own business.
Salut, je m'appelle Georges Bams.
I said to myself, as soon as I graduated, now at least I can get off the bike, because now, with these diplomas, if I can find something to do, someone can hire me. And that was not the case.
À Kinshasa.
On a good day, the 27-year-old makes around $30. But with Democratic Republic of Congo's rampant inflation, the depreciation of the Congolese franc, and multiple demands on his meager income, Bamoué struggles to make ends meet.
We don't just have to take care of ourselves, because we have a younger brother or sister, and sometimes they run up to us to ask, "Can you help me with that?" And then you have to do something for them. And for yourself, you will also pay the rent. Eat during the day, get dressed too, put in the fuel, pay for your electricity and water.
Like millions of Congolese who will head to the polls on December the 20th, he has seen little improvement in living conditions despite Congo's vast wealth in critical minerals and President Felix Tshisekedi's 2019 promise to create more jobs. DRC is among the fastest growing economies in sub-Saharan Africa, boosted by its mining sector. It's the world's top supplier of battery-grade cobalt and the third largest copper producer. But little has trickled down to the majority of its nearly 100 million people, where around 62% live on less than $1 a day. Bamoué said he voted in 2018 hoping for a change which he did not get, but is willing to give one more chance, hoping that the president who will come can at least make things better.
In the meantime, the United Nations Security Council has voted unanimously in favor of gradually phasing out its peacekeeping operations known as MONUSCO in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The 15-member body voted on Tuesday to draw down peacekeeping forces in the Central African nation about a year earlier than originally scheduled, despite continued concerns over violence. Despite these concerns over security, Congolese authorities have persistently called for the UN to scale down its presence in the country, saying it has failed to protect civilians from armed groups.
Negotiations on a plethora of issues, the A3 voted in favor of the draft resolution because we believe that it signifies an effort on the part of the pen holder to bridge widely divergent views expressed from negotiations on a plethora of issues in the DRC, which have a direct bearing on MONUSCO's mandate, such as human rights, armed groups, and regional support, among others.
Mr. President, the United States is proud to have voted in favor of this resolution, which clearly responds to the Democratic Republic of Congo's request to change the status quo, while maintaining the mission's core responsibility to protect civilians amidst its gradual, responsible, and sustainable withdrawal. The United States also appreciates that the Council responded quickly and favorably to the DRC government's formal request for MONUSCO to provide logistical support to national elections in North Kivu, South Kivu, Ituri, and other provinces.
And finally on the program, not one, not two, but 5 million Christmas light bulbs brought festive cheers and joy in Croatia. This is all thanks to a man's childhood dream of having a real Christmas tree, which inspired him to create a festival of lights that grows each year and now totals 5 million light bulbs at his estate in central Croatia. Zako Salaj, the owner of the Christmas theme park known as Salajland, says that he had dreamed of such a Christmas fairy tale since he was a boy. He launched the lighting project in 2001, with 70,000 lamps increasing their numbers each year. The number of visitors to his park has grown accordingly and is estimated at about 100,000 annually. Over the weekend, hundreds of delighted visitors from Croatia and neighboring countries were adorned with millions of lights on trees, bushes, wooden cottages and bridges. It's really a village of lights and Christmas lights wonderland, as some people will say. That's the program today. Thank you so much for being a part of it. I'm Joke Rogers. Bye for now.